Thanks, Fareed.
So to me, this is really important and interesting. Explain what SunEdison does.
So I started SunEdison in 2003, sold it in 2009, and now I'm at Generate Capital. But I think the main purpose of SunEdison was to say that all of this innovative technology that has a payback, people don't want to wait for a payback. They don't want to pay 8 years of electricity up front and then say, I'm going to wait 8 years to get it back, right? That's not the relationship they currently have with their utility company. So we invented solar as a service. So it's no money down. You just put it on the roof. You pay a 10% discount to what you are currently paying your utility. Right. And it took off. I mean, we've had about $1.4 trillion that's been funded through that financial structure that we created back in 2003.
So why isn't that approach being used for everything in energy? Because it seems to me, I built a house a few years ago. I put in geothermal. You could have made the same argument about that. You could make the same, isn't this a model that should apply to all energy?
Yeah, that's precisely what we're doing now at Generate Capital. So ultimately, what you find is that the banking sector, as much as everybody wants it to be rational, and someone read a 100-page briefing and then they said yes or no at the investment committee, it's actually quite social, right? If 5 of their friends haven't funded that same deal, they're not interested in funding the deal. And you see that with fuel cells or anaerobic digesters or geothermal heat pumps like Dandelion Energy is doing up in New York, or all these other companies. We also own behind-the-meter battery storage. Even electric vehicle buses are hard to fund by traditional banks, right? Because they immediately securitize those in Wall Street. Wall Street's saying, I don't know what the residual value of an electric bus is. I just don't know how to put that into a spreadsheet. So therefore, I'm not going to allow it in this securitization vehicle. And so you'd be surprised at how many things are not moving. And that's why we created Generate to help be that catalyst for those types of technologies.
And describe what is happening with solar now, because it feels like, if I have it right, partly because of the model you came up with, there was almost a quadrupling of U.S. solar capacity, basically, over the last decade.
Yeah.
That growth rate seems to have slowed. Is that because of technology? Is it because of financing? What's going on?
So the way that energy works, and it's something that I think is really hard for most folks to fully appreciate, is that it's not like the tech boom that we're sitting in here, right? Where it's a consumer product, Bill Gates says that everybody's going to have a computer and it all takes off, right? Everything we do is optional. We're offsetting an incumbent, right? You already get electricity, right? So if we put in more solar, that's less kilowatt hours that are produced by that coal plant. If we put in more wind, same thing, right? So the only way we get to exist once we get above, let's say, 1% penetration, which we've already reached, is through government regulation, right? So, we have to force utility companies to buy our power and to shut down power plants that they're currently getting power from. And so people tell me this all the time. They say, well, the IEA wants solar to get to 300 gigawatts from 100 gigawatts to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. How do you propose we get that? Government regulation, right? It's not.
Presumably, price would be another one, but you're saying it's impossible to compete with coal on price, or?
Well, the price is already there. So, for instance, Idaho Power, which you don't expect to be the most liberal utility in the country, has already announced they're going to go to 100% renewables. The next day, they signed a contract at 2.1 cents a kilowatt hour for solar with an escalator for 25 years, which is much cheaper, right, than coal. Their coal plants generate power at 5-6 cents a kilowatt hour, right? So. But they're not immediately saying we're going to shut down these coal plants, because they're saying, we have people that work there, we have long-term contracts, we have a relationship here, our grid operations group knows how to use it. And so they need someone to say, no, you're going to shut it down in 2025. Here's like 6 years to figure it out, and you will build solar or wind or fuel cells or geothermal or hydro or any other renewable energy technology. And that will happen. In 2012, I was at Rio Plus 20. I was on stage with the energy minister of Brazil, and he pounded the table and said, I will never allow solar and wind in my country, right? And the next year, there was an all-requirements bid, and solar and wind were the cheapest, so he selected only solar and wind, right? And today, with the real and all the other, sort of political instability in Brazil, solar is getting huge amounts of investment dollars into Brazil. So that energy minister is saying, if I want economic development, I kind of have to have a solar and wind plan.
So Neil Chatterjee yesterday talked about de-risking energy infrastructure. Do you think that's happening? Do you wish there were more? How would you describe the situation?
Yeah, I think that, ultimately, when you think about the changes that we're going through, if I were to put solar on a large shopping mall, and that shopping mall were to shut down, right, who do I sell that power to, right? This is an investment that was made under the auspices of a renewable portfolio standard that the state of California wants to support, but the technical details of how I take that power off of a dark mall and send it into the grid and who pays me and how that works matters. If I don't know that, then I'm going to charge private equity interest rates. I'm going to charge 20+% returns because I'm taking 20+% return risk, right? And if they want me to come in at 6% returns, which is where solar is trading today, then I need 6% risks, right? And that is exactly what Neil's talking about with natural gas pipelines, with all sorts of stuff that the FERC regulates.
When your current firm, Generate Capital, the idea is to come up with investments in these renewables, and it's proved to be a challenge for a lot of capital providers. I think that they underestimated the degree to which there will be a longer lead time for adoption, maybe underestimated the amount, the capital that had to be committed. What's different about your model? Why will you succeed when some of the more established VC players who went into this game failed?
Well, so it's a weird thing, right? I think the direct answer to your question is because I've been through it before and started the largest solar company in the world. So in essence, I've been through that and I know their pain. So I can empathize with them on the other side. But the confusion here is real, right? So there's a lot of people, particularly in this area, who believe that there's a line that goes between university research, venture capital, right, breakthrough stuff from Bill Gates, to valley of death financing with the government, loan guarantee program, to me. And that's not true. There's like a 10-year gap between those two things, right? I don't want a technology that's not more than 10 years old, right, or less than 10 years old, right? Because remember, I'm making an investment for 25 years. If that technology fails because we didn't realize that pollution had a problem or water quality has a problem or this thing or that thing affects the life of that asset, I just lost money, right? Some of these assets that I invest in have a 9-year payback before I actually even get my principal back before I even start making a return, right? So it's not like someone can say, well, I just created this new battery technology. Jigar, I'd like to do a $100 million rollout with PG&E. I was like, great. PG&E is going to pay me fixed payments as you provide a service. If that battery fails to provide the service, they won't pay me, right? I can imagine that is, really problematic, right? So I think that people want to believe that R&D dollars here, VC dollars here, turns into me getting excited over here. I'm a very boring person. I actually want to make sure that what I'm funding is going to make sense. But the good news is there are hundreds of technologies, including fuel cells, that were invented in the 70s and actually have 30 years of history. And yes, they're improved today, their efficiency is better than it was yesterday and all that stuff, but the fundamental science has actually been tested for 30 years, right? And so we're one of the largest fuel cell investors, right? And so we're very comfortable with those technologies because they're scary to other people, but the data actually shows that they're not scary.
You believe the private sector can play the lead role here.
Yes.
So explain, in your vision, what is it the government needs to do and what is it the private sector can do to really be the lead player?
So in the United States, we all get very confused about how energy works, right? The federal government has almost no role in energy in this country, right? So everyone says, oh, the United States is terrible compared to Germany, right? No, the EU is actually terrible on energy, right? The United States is like the EU. California is fantastic, and they're probably better than Germany. So and they have a better, I think they're even a bigger economy than Germany today. So I think that we start by saying the federal government has done their job. They provide a 30% tax credit to fuel cells, 30% tax credit to solar. They're winding that down now, which is great. And they set some rules of the road on a regulatory basis for Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But the actual programs and economic development comes from the states. Today you've got 6 states that have passed laws that mandate 100% clean energy. It's not technology specific, it's not renewables. It's actually clean energy, so it could be small modular reactors, it could be fuel cells, it could be lots of things. And I think you'll see more. You've got other states that have passed 50% clean energy standards, et cetera. And so my sense is that's the regulation I need at the state level. The federal level, I need some tax credits to help with bringing down the costs of technologies that need to scale up to get their costs down. And for the private sector, we have to set the rules of the game for the developers, right? We have to say, if you meet this checklist, I will fund your project, right? Because in the solar business, what people don't realize, and obviously it's true with fuel cells and other things, the vast majority of developers are mortgaging their house, right? Everyone's like, oh, these developers, they're wildcatters, they're like fracking people, they just have $100 million from Wall Street. No, most of these folks are taking a $200,000 home equity loan out on their house. They're using that to develop the project. They then come to me with the checklist filled out, and then they want us to fund $30 million for the project. And then that's how they make their development fee, right? And so it is foolish for them to take that mortgage out in their house if they don't know exactly what my checklist is. And that's what we do. We give people checklists, right? We say, if you do this and meet this standard, I will fund you, right? And that is hugely important. In the private sector today, in the US, does that at a rate of around $200 billion a year. So it's not small.
So you don't wish that the federal government were to put on a carbon tax, for example?
Well, I wish lots of things, right? I mean, I wish that, we had, pay equality for women. I wish that we had all these things, right? But in the end, I don't think politically a carbon tax has been workable in Canada or Australia, right? The opposing political party uses it to gain power and rescind the policy. What's worked is sectoral policy, right? So here's how we're going to do electricity. Here's how we're going to do transport. Here's how we're going to do industry, right? That's what's worked. And I think that even at the federal government level, that's what will work. And so I'm a big fan of what we've been doing because I'm a practical guy. I like to see things that work.
So I notice a paradox, which is the Department of Energy funded a whole bunch of the clean technology, green technology that we have today.
Yep.
And yet, when you look at the major manufacturers of clean technology, they're almost all European or Asian. What happened to American companies, and can they regain that momentum, that leadership?
Well, I appreciate you asking me this question, but I know that you probably could answer it better than I can. I think, look, I say this not trying to be provocative, but I grew up in a small town in Illinois named Sterling, Illinois. We had the 7th largest steel mill in the country, and it shut down while I was there. So I studied this a lot just because, everyone cared about it there. This was the policy of the United States of America to export our pollution from here to China, right? The 80s, the 90s, and then when Bill Clinton came into office, he said, let's give it most favored nation status so that these people who spend $1 billion in China don't think that their investment's at risk, right? Let's just normalize relations, right? Well, if that's the stated policy of the US government, when Canada and Germany were doing exactly the opposite. They had industrial policy. Remember, industrial policy is a 4-letter word, right? Many Democrats and Republicans don't want industrial policy. Oh, the government shouldn't be involved in the private sector. But everything worth doing in this country was done with industrial policy, right? Whether it was the hydro dams, the Eisenhower expressways, World War II mobilization, even the semiconductor sector was Semitech, right, for the federal government. And so I just think that for whatever reason, we've been lost in the wilderness for 35 years. And whatever you believe about Trump or whatever else, I do think going and figuring out our relationship with China and figuring out how to support industrial policy in this country is important. I certainly don't think the U.S. has anything holding it back from making stuff here. The challenge is just that we have to want to make stuff here, and we have to set a set of policies that Canada and Germany already have done to do that here.
Do you think there's a value to, because underneath the premise, and you're exactly right, really ever since the Reagan era, has been this kind of libertarian view that, look, if the consumer gets a better deal at a lower price, what difference where the stuff is made? Do you think there's a value to actually manufacturing this, and having those companies be in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who, I have hired thousands of people into the companies that I have, run and funded, right? And I find that valuable, right? I mean, we pay, I think, about 28% over the, sort of average, according to Bloomberg, for clean energy jobs. We actually provide people careers. I don't think the gig economy is a good thing. I think people being able to drive Lyft for $12 an hour and then losing their job and then getting some other job or whatever else is a very unstable way to live. I don't know that they feel great about that. I love giving people careers, right? A lot of folks who don't have a high school education, who might have a high school education, 6 weeks of training, they're on the job, and 10 years later, I'm paying them 3 times what I was paying them earlier because they're 3 times better, right? And I think the same thing's true for manufacturing. It's odd to me that we believe, every economist has studied this and already said this, right? When you have manufacturing, you have like a 10x multiplier in the local economy, whereas service jobs only have a 2x multiplier. And so the data is actually quite clear, and the costs of labor in something like solar panel is trivial, just trivial, right? And so it doesn't matter what you charge there. What matters is that China's giving 3% interest money to all their manufacturers to build the plant, to do all the stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And so then their cost of capital is lower than it is here, right?
And do you buy the argument that by having manufacturing here, you also actually improve the quality of an innovation? Because we have this model of an innovation where it's 4 guys in a research lab in at a university or in Microsoft Research Center, but that actually there is a symbiotic relationship between manufacturing and research, that you watch what's doing well, you try it out on the factory floor.
Yeah, well, I certainly believe that. I mean, I know that in the solar industry, we've overcome that, right? Every innovation worth talking about in solar has been invented here in the United States. Not in Germany, not in Japan, not in Holland, not in some other country, in the United States. There's 3 people who have actually trained every PhD person in the solar industry, right? And
all in the U.S.
All in the U.S., right? And then 1 person in University of New South Wales in Australia. And, I just think, and all of that technology has gotten into Chinese manufacturing, right? So today, we have, when I won the contract for New York City buildings for solar 3 years ago, the most efficient solar panel was 320 watts. That was cost effective. Today, it's 390 for the same exact footprint, right? That's all US PERC technology on monocrystalline silicon cells in Taiwan and in China, right? And so we figured out how to do that. I agree with you that the cycle would be faster probably if we had it here, but we figured it out. I just think we shouldn't kid ourselves. It's not because US folks can't compete, it's because we've been asked not to be in the game.
Talk a little bit about your background. How did you come to do what you're doing? You grew up in Illinois. Presumably your parents were like doctors?
Yeah, it's the funniest thing. I mean, I was born in India, came here when I was 1. We moved to a rural town like many Indian doctors did because that's where the jobs were. And, my dad was one of those people that, I don't know if you remember, like back then in the 80s, they had all these people from like Southwestern Books, and they would knock on your door in the summers and try to sell you stuff. And my dad was a sucker. He just bought every book that anybody, those people were selling. And one of them was on energy. And it was really an amazing thing because every energy source had 2 pages, right? So it was basically one of those books where you open it up and you have a 2-page spread on how coal works, how nuclear works, how solar works. So at a young age, I actually thought that they were all equal, right? Because they all got 2 pages. And so I don't know, I went to high school one day and said, you know what, I want to work in renewable energy. It was very obvious to me back then, and it wasn't about...
High school?
In high school. It was very obvious to me that like it was going to be clean energy. It wasn't about climate change, because I didn't know what climate change was in the 80s. It was really more about, it just made sense to me that you use the splitting of the atom, use the sun, use the wind. I mean, if you talk to a 5-year-old and you ask where the energy comes from, that's what they're going to tell you, right? It's only like this modern day phenomenon that we decided that we need everything in our country to be a Rube Goldberg experiment, right? Think about how this works, right? To meet the air quality standards in Georgia, we have figured out how to bring clean coal from Wyoming. You ship it all the way to Georgia. We then burn it there. You then actually like have a scrubber to take out whatever's bad. That scrubber creates coal ash, which is terrible. You then put it in an unlined pond, which now we have to go back in and dig out and line, right? The whole thing is just a big liability. And you could tell that from 2 pages, right? And so I talked to a bunch of my uncles. They said, Jigar, you're too smart to waste your life in renewable energy. I said, I want to do it anyway. I went to the University of Illinois because they had a couple of professors who actually were still working on renewable energy. None of the other colleges that I got into, Cornell and others, didn't really have it.
This is in the 80s?
Yeah, I went in 92 is when I went into college. And I was lucky that I had a lot of professors that encouraged me. I got in my car. I went to all like 100 people that had solar firms in 1996. They had like a membership issue of their magazines. I called them all and got a job finally, and was off to the races, and it was fun.
So you, right out of college, you went and got a job with a solar company.
Well, unfortunately, none of them would hire me, so I got a wind energy job out of college. And then, which was fine. I had a great time.
Also had 2 pages.
Yes, also had 2 pages. And then I got to work at BP, and it was really amazing. I started in the solar division, but they very quickly had me work on hydrogen, natural gas. It was really extraordinary. They're just such an extraordinary firm around innovation and bringing innovation to market, and so it was fun.
So what do you see? What is the goal? Obviously, you've made a lot of money. The Generate Capital will do well, but what is the goal? What do you want Generate Capital to be able to have done?
So I had the good fortune to work with Richard Branson in the interim years. And what he convinced me of, and I totally agree with him now, is that this doesn't get done by technology, right? We all talk about technology, and Gates says this thing, and this person says this one, and Vaclav Smil says this, and they all basically have been wrong because this gets done by human force of will, right? So there's 10,000 entrepreneurs that matter in the world right now that are working on this stuff. And empowering those 10,000 entrepreneurs to be able to have that checklist is what I'm about, right? After their technology comes out, they have a phase change material, they took it out of the Department of Defense, they want to commercialize it, whatever it is that they want to do, right, that's in the carbon space, we want to figure out how to give them the tools to be able to succeed or fail, right? They're going to succeed or fail based on their own competence. But I don't want them to fail because they don't have a contact at Goldman Sachs, right? I want them to fail or succeed because of their own merits. And that's really what Generate Capital is about. I think that when you think about solar and wind, I love solar and wind, but we're not going to decarbonize the whole world with solar and wind, right? And we're going to decarbonize it with 120 different pathways, all of which that make it to $1 trillion scale. And that's simply going to come from these entrepreneurs and their indomitable will.
Jigar, pleasure to have you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
That was terrific.